Concept 22.2 says, descent with modification by natural selection explains the adaptations of organisms and the unity and diversity of life. Let's get into a little bit of history of Charles Darwin himself. Here's a picture, or obviously not a photograph, but a drawing or a painting of Charles Darwin. This would have been about the time shortly after his voyage on the Beagle. Photography, of course, was not very much around in his early days, although we do have some cool photographs of Darwin later in his life. It says here that some doubt about the permanence of species preceded Darwin's ideas. Darwin was not the first to have these ideas, and there were other people, again, that were working on this idea as well. Although the majority of people felt that species had remained unchanged since their creation, numerous philosophers and scientists weren't so sure if that was the way it was. So let's talk a bit about Darwin's research. As a boy, he was basically a science geek from the get-go. He was very actively involved and interested in science as a kid, collecting bugs and exploring his environment and things like that. Always kind of fascinated by science and nature. His dad in particular, didn't think that being a naturalist was really a way to go. That wasn't going to make you much money. So they convinced Darwin to go off to medical school. Darwin first began his college at Cambridge University studying medicine. He switched after a time to theology and religion. Oftentimes those people who wanted to be sort of a naturalist or study nature oftentimes went ahead and got a theology degree. You'll note people like Gregor Mendel and other early scientists were often theologians or members of the church in some way. He basically left medicine because you have to think at this time surgeries were not really done with anesthetic all that much, so that kind of freaked him out, and he wasn't a big fan of that type of thing. If you were going to have to chop off a guy's leg because it became infected, you basically just gave him something to bite down on and gave him a swig of alcohol and you started cutting. So that was not really Darwin's thing, so he veered from medicine, went into theology, and started studying at Cambridge University. After he graduated, he was recommended by a fellow a professor that kind of took him under his wing. He was recommended to a Captain Robert Fitzroy, who was a young captain of a ship called the Beagle. And the Beagle was an exploratory vessel that was supposed to go around the world and explore the coast of South Africa and help map it further. So this was an unpaid position. Darwin paid his own way to go on this voyage. But Fitzroy said, yeah, you can come with me, because Fitzroy was about the same age as Darwin. They were both fairly young, and Fitzroy was also kind of an amateur scientist himself, and he thought it would be cool to have Darwin along. So they started on ultimately a 5-year journey around the world on this ship, the HMS Beagle. During his time going around the world on the Beagle, Darwin spent enormous amounts of his time collecting specimens, particularly of South American plants and animals. He collected and observed all sorts of fossils and examples of living creatures from those regions, and he noted that the fossils that he collected most closely resembled living species from that same area, and that the living species resembled other species from nearby regions. So he would note that if you were in South America, you might find creatures in various parts of South America that were alike, but once you went to Australia or some other part of the world, there weren't a lot of the same creatures that were alike. He also experienced a pretty big earthquake that occurred at the time that they were in and around Chile, and he observed that along the shoreline there in Chile, when they got off of the ship, that huge amounts of soil and rock had been thrust upward, and that got him thinking more about some of the geology that he was discussing and reading. He had been reading Lyell's books about geology during this time as well, and he even found fossils of ocean creatures, seashells and the like, high up in the Andes Mountains, and he had to try to think, how did these sea creatures get high up in the mountains? And he inferred that perhaps these rocks had been raised up over time by geologic activity, similar to what he saw to a minor degree with the earthquakes. So he had a lot of interesting information that he gathered, and all these various examples of creatures and all these various examples of geology as well. As I mentioned, Darwin was influenced by Lyell's book called The Principles of Geology, and he began to think that the Earth surely had to be more than the often accepted 6,000 years old for these things to have occurred. They stopped at one point in the Galapagos Islands, which is a chain of islands west of South America near the equator, and they spent quite a bit of time there on the Galapagos Islands, and he was especially entranced by the creatures that he found there on those islands. He hypothesized that the species from South America had been transported to the Galapagos perhaps by storms or floating debris, and that they had colonized the Galapagos Islands and then began to become different. They had speciated on the islands due to environmental pressures. So what his thought was that the creatures you found on these islands originally came from the South American mainland, but they were not the same because the environment was different there on the island, and over time those creatures changed to become adapted to their environment. Here's a great map showing his voyages. So here is that picture I showed you earlier, kind of a painting of what Darwin looked like, kind of a painting of what the ship looked like, and their journeys took them from Great Britain all the way down to the coast of South America, all around the coast of South America. They went around. Here would be the Galapagos Islands. Here's kind of a blown up view of all those little Galapagos Islands. They went around the globe, coming back to Australia, New Zealand, and then back around the Horn, the Cape of Good Hope, the southern portion of Africa, again back to South America, and then finally made their way back to Great Britain. So this was an extremely long, multi-year journey of traveling around the world. In all of this journey, it's the Galapagos Islands that are most closely associated with Darwin and his work and his ideas. The Galapagos Islands are a unique ecosystem because they are fairly separated from the mainland, and you will find certain creatures there that you won't find anywhere else, and you will not find certain creatures there that you will find on the mainland. So while there are some things that are alike between, say, the South American animals and what you might find here on the Galapagos, they are certainly different species, and they behave and they look in a different way. So here is a nice kind of overview of what some of the islands look like. Iguanas, there were heavy populations of both land and marine iguanas. Marine iguanas that swim and dive in the ocean had never been seen before. This was the only place they had ever been seen. There were these massive tortoises that were found on the islands, and these are what are called blue-footed boobies, a type of seabird that were found on the islands. So these are some of the things that Darwin saw in his travels there in those Galapagos Islands that you can still go and see today. When Darwin got back home and he was basically reassessing what did he learn throughout this voyage, reassessing his observations, he perceived that adaptation to the environment and the origin of a new species was a closely related process. He saw this idea that creatures are well suited to their environment, and this idea that creatures change over time as being part of the same process. From his studies made years after his voyage, biologists have kind of come around to even further define what Darwin found on the Galapagos Islands, and they have concluded, it's fairly obvious with the evidence we have today, that that's exactly what happened on those islands and elsewhere throughout the earth. For example, one type of bird that Darwin studied was the finches, and they're well known, these finches of the Galapagos Islands, and what Darwin saw has been studied and studied in the years since his lifetime, and it's been shown to be quite correct. So with his finches, what he found was that there was this particular type of bird called a finch, but that the birds were not all alike. As he traveled from island to island, he noted differences, and the differences related primarily to the island environments and what was the primary food source for those particular birds. So while these finches, they seem to have a commonality amongst them, they seem to have a common ancestor, they had become different. So cactus eaters and insect eaters and seed eaters, if you look at their beaks, you can note obvious differences, and those obvious differences make them well suited to their particular environment. So if you live on an island that has a large number of hard-shelled seeds, that might become the primary food source, and so to have this strong crushing beak like this bird, that would be an obvious helpful adaptation. Here an insect eater has a pointy, sharp beak for catching and impaling insects, which wouldn't really be helpful at all if he was trying to eat hard-shelled seeds. So you can see they are alike, but they're different, and this is kind of some of the ideas that Darwin was working with based on his travels. So after his travels in about 1844, Darwin wrote a very long essay on what he called natural selection. That was the name for the mechanism of descent with modification that he felt like the evidence provided for him. But he didn't really introduce his theory publicly. He didn't publish it in any scientific papers or go to any scientific conferences and speak about it. Natural selection, let's kind of define that, is a process in which individuals with favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on those traits to offspring. So if you are perhaps a lion born with the ability to run slightly faster, or perhaps you are a snake who happens to be born with a coloration that camouflages you just a little bit better, that means there is a slight chance that you're going to be more successful in life. You're going to live longer, reproduce more often, and then pass on those genetics more likely to your offspring. So Darwin did write his initial essays and thoughts down way back in 1844, but he was kind of hesitant to reveal these ideas because he knew that many people would disagree, and he also felt that his ideas would be problematic and sort of controversial, particularly from a religious standpoint. Darwin wasn't particularly talking about human beings when he was discussing his ideas of evolution initially, but he knew that just the idea of saying that animals had changed over time, much less humans, contradicted what a lot of people believed, and he knew that it would be problematic. You have to remember that Darwin himself studied to be a clergyman, and his wife was religious, and of course most of his friends and colleagues were religious, and they held certain views, and he knew it might be a problem. Well, he also worried that someone else would discover these ideas and publicize these ideas, and that almost pretty much happened in June of 1858. So that is, notice, that is a number of years after Darwin wrote down his ideas. In June of 1858, Darwin received a manuscript from another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was studying in another part of the world. He had basically developed the exact same ideas and the exact same theory of natural selection. And Darwin pretty much panicked. He said to some of his other colleagues, what am I going to do? All my work and all my thoughts now are no longer going to be considered novel or new. So he did speak with Alfred Russel Wallace, and they did actually present a paper together, but that spurred Darwin to go ahead and get his act together and gather all his information and finish writing his book and publish it. Darwin quickly did that. He finished The Origin of Species and published it the very next year. Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection was published in 1859, and in it Darwin explained three broad observations which we've already mentioned: the unity of life, the diversity of life, and the match between organisms and their environment. And this book, although I would suggest that any biology major or biology student or science literate person who wants to really understand this idea read the book. It was written in 1859, and I'm not going to lie to you, it's pretty difficult to read. It's a science book written over 100 years ago. It's not easy reading, but it is pretty fascinating. Darwin was a meticulous scientist, and he lays out a great argument for his theory of evolution via natural selection, and it is backed, even in 1859, with an enormous amount of data and facts. And of course now we've added so much more. It's just amazing. Darwin it would blow his mind to know what we know today. So within a decade, Darwin's book and its proponents had basically convinced most scientists that life's diversity is the product of evolution and change over time. Darwin succeeded where previous evolution proponents had failed, and that's mainly because he presented a plausible scientific mechanism. In science, you cannot just throw out an idea. You also need to be able to explain how that idea works and provide evidence for that. And Darwin did that. He presented this plausible scientific mechanism with immaculate logic and an avalanche of evidence, and it was overwhelmingly accepted, even in the early days, by most biologists and scientists. It was pretty soon the accepted idea, as opposed to the idea that creatures did not change since the beginning of time. As I mentioned previously, Darwin never actually used the word evolution in the first edition of The Origin of Species. The very last phrases of the book does use the word evolve or evolving, but the actual word evolution doesn't even really appear, especially in the first edition. He used the phrase descent with modification, and that kind of summarized his perception of the unity of life. And this phrase refers to the view that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in the very remote past, and that they accumulated adaptations over time, and that's what led to the diversity of life we see today. In the Darwinian view, the history of life is kind of like a tree with many branches representing life's diversity. And Darwin's theory meshed very well with the hierarchy of Linnaeus. Linnaeus didn't necessarily believe in this idea of evolution, but his way of categorizing living creatures actually matched up pretty well to this Darwinian idea of evolution. So I'm sure you've seen variations on this tree of life to where you have at one point you have a beginning point, which is called Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and then there are various branches off of that. Some of the very early branches would be the bacteria and the archaea, and then you have single-celled eukaryotes, algae, and plants, and then you get to fungi, and then you have animals. So you have this branching way of looking at life, and there's a variety of evidences that we'll take a look at that kind of help us understand how this branching works. As a matter of fact, if we look at some of Darwin's own notebooks, he was a copious note taker. He had many science notebooks that he wrote information down and ideas, and perhaps one of the most famous pages from his notebook is right here. This is a sketch of Darwin's, we'll call it the Tree of Life, from his scientific notebook dated 1837, and in it he drew this basic diagram. And at the top, for me, one of the most amazing things was he wrote this two-word phrase. So he drew out this diagram to try to explain his own thoughts to himself. This was not for anyone else. This was for himself in his own scientific notebook, and how he said, okay, you start right here with this one creature, and then there's these various branches, and they branch off and end up with, say, this species A and D and C and B. And he also wrote some notes off to the side explaining his diagram. But for me, the greatest thing is right at the top he wrote, I think. And that to me is pretty powerful. He was not someone who said, this is what I know. It's not dogmatic. It's what I think. This is what the evidence is showing me. And this is a pretty powerful phrase, because I think this diagram and this two-word phrase represents the whole idea of science. And for me, I really like that. There's a chart in your textbook that kind of shows this idea of descent with modification, and it uses the example of living elephants. Right now on Earth there are 3 living species of elephants. There is the Asian elephant, which kind of has a bulbous head and little ears, and then there's 2 different species of African elephants which look a bit different. Their head is a little bit more sloped and they have big, more fan-shaped ears. And then there's also some distant relatives of elephants that are still alive today. The manatees, the sea cows that live down in Florida, off the coast of Florida, and these little creatures that are called hyrax, which totally just look like a little guinea pig rat creature. Neither one of these look anything like elephants, but they are distantly related. Now there is a wide variety of creatures that used to be around that are all extinct. Some of them you might recognize as the mammoth, the woolly mammoth, and then others you probably have never seen before. Some of them died out long ago, like some of these guys here, and some of them made it closer to our present day. Probably the most closely would be the mammoth here. And then these are still around. All of these, if we can trace them back, you can see how they're related. So at the points where the branches join together, that's the common ancestor for that branching point. So why do the 2 species of African elephants look more alike than the Asian elephant? Well, that's because they share a more recent common ancestor. So their common ancestor is fairly close in time than, say, the common ancestor between the Asian elephant and the African ones. So the further you go back in time, you'll find that they probably share less as far as physical characteristics and the like. And if you go far enough back in time, there's a point right here. This would be, it says, about 60 million years ago. There is a common ancestor between these 2 varieties of creatures that are still alive today and the elephants that are still alive today. In between, there were a lot of twigs that didn't make it, that died off. But this represents one branch of the tree of life. And in this branch, there are a couple of twigs that still survive up here and a few twigs that still survive down here. Most of them don't. Most of them didn't make it to the present day. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of living creatures, the vast majority of species that have ever lived, perhaps over 90%, they're not around anymore. They went extinct. So the living creatures you see today are not the same as the creatures that were around millions of years ago. They are descendants of those creatures. Now, you would never say that the manatee evolved into an elephant. That's not correct at all. Both of these are creatures that are around today. That would be like saying that humans evolved from current day chimpanzees. That's not correct at all. It is more correct to say they have a common ancestor at some point in their past. Now, between humans and chimpanzees, that common ancestor is not so far back as between the manatee and the elephant. We have a lot more similarities, genetic similarities and body shape similarities and that type of thing, anatomical similarities. So no, you would not say the manatee evolved from the elephant or the elephant evolved from the manatee. That's not the way it works. It would be more correct to say that they do have a common ancestor, in this case way back in the past. Same thing with apes, orangutans or gorillas or chimpanzees and humans. Humans did not evolve from current day chimpanzees. No current species evolved from another currently surviving species, but you could say that they survived, or they evolved from a descendant, a shared common descendant, perhaps many, many years ago. One of the ways that Darwin discussed his ideas of evolution in his book was the idea of using the idea of artificial selection, natural selection, and adaptation. So Darwin started out by talking in his book about artificial selection, which is very common and very easy for people to see. He noted that humans have been modifying other species by selecting and breeding those individuals who have desired traits. We've been doing that forever. It's a process called artificial selection. We've been doing that in agriculture. We have done that with breeds of dogs. We have done that with a wide variety of creatures. And so think about, for example, a dog, comparing a Chihuahua to a Saint Bernard. Those amount of changes, that was all from artificial selection. That was all from selective breeding that humans have done to the original creature that we would have called a dog. So while we still call a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard the same species, well, in reality, they probably wouldn't be called the same species if we found those two in the wild. If you found a Chihuahua skeleton, remains, fossil, and a Saint Bernard fossil and remains, you might say these are two creatures that are closely related, but certainly, would you think they're the same species? You probably would not. So this idea of species, we have to be careful. It's not always clearly defined as we would like. And through artificial selection, we have created enormous changes in plants, in animals, even in pets like dogs. So he drew basically two inferences from his observations here that we'll talk about. Here's a good example of selection that humans have done. This plant in the middle is the wild mustard plant. It is basically the forerunner of all these other plants that you see. So choosing for different traits has basically created different types of plants. So from the wild mustard we got Brussels sprouts and cabbage and broccoli and kale and all of these variety of plants that we now grow on farms and eat and use for different purposes, but they actually all originally derived from this wild mustard. And through artificial selection, through selective breeding, we have made these changes that you see. So what were Darwin's two observations that kind of relate to artificial selection, natural selection, and adaptation? Well, his first observation was that members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. If you look at this bunch of ladybugs on the log here, you see how they're not all exact copies of each other. They have variations in color, variations in number of spots. You can look around your classroom with 30 human students and you can see the wide amount of genetic variation. So that was observation number one. Members of a population vary in their inherited traits. Darwin's observation number two was that all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce. It doesn't matter if you're talking about humans, or in this case we're talking about fungus, or dogs, or whales in the ocean. Most living creatures tend to reproduce at a higher rate than the environment can support. For example, this spore cloud that you see from this one mushroom, this one fungus, may contain millions of spores. If each one of those spores were able to grow into a full-grown fungus, the entire earth would be covered in fungus. If every mouse baby survived and grew up into a full-grown mouse adult, the earth would be overrun. That's not the way that nature works. Most living creatures tend to reproduce far more than the environment can support, and that means many of those offspring will not survive, will fail to reproduce, will not pass on their genetics. So from these two observations, he inferred two things. Inference number one: individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a particular environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. And that seems to make common sense. If you compare these two birds, one of them happened to be born with a long pointy beak, one of them with a short stubby beak. If worms or grubs in little tree holes is their main source of food, well, this guy on the right is going to be more successful than this guy on the left. That means the guy on the right is more likely to live longer, which means he's more likely to reproduce, pass on his genetics for that long beak. The guy on the left, not as likely to survive, not as likely to be able to reproduce and pass on his genes. Inference number two: this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. What that means is, if you are an insect who happens to be born and you look slightly like a leaf, maybe not this much like a leaf, but just slightly more like a leaf than your brothers and sisters, well, you're slightly more likely to survive longer, reproduce, and pass on those genetics. In your next generation, perhaps one of your offspring is lucky enough, just through genetic mutation, through the random chance of genetic mutation, maybe one of your offspring looks even more like a leaf than you did. Well, again, that particular offspring will have an even better chance. Well, what happens is these adaptations that are helpful, they tend to build and accumulate. These favorable traits accumulate over generations until you end up with a creature that looks like this, an insect that is almost indistinguishable from a leaf. You have this accumulation of favorable traits. Now, if you were born an insect like this, bright yellow with red polka dots, that would not be a favorable trait. You would probably die very early in your life, and that would probably not get passed on. So you're not probably going to see too many katydids with that coloration, because that's not a very helpful trait. So these two ideas led to these two inferences that Darwin came up with. I mentioned earlier that Darwin was influenced by not just scientists in his field, but he was also influenced by other people, including an economist named Thomas Malthus, who actually published some work prior to Darwin's life. Malthus noted the potential for human population to increase faster than food supplies and other resources. So Malthus kind of indicated that not only do other animals do this, but humans do this as well. Humans sometimes tend to out-reproduce their environment, and that leads to famine and starvation and disease outbreaks and other problems. And if some heritable traits are advantageous, these will accumulate in a population over time, and this will increase the frequency of individuals with these traits. So this process of out-reproducing your environment and some creatures having advantageous traits, that basically leads to this match between organisms and their environment. Darwin felt that this ability to overpopulate was a trait that all living creatures shared. He saw that not only in humans, but in other creatures that he studied. So if you have more babies than the environment can support, but some of those babies have traits that give them an advantage, those are the ones that are most likely to survive. Those are the traits most likely to be passed on, and you will have an accumulation of those traits. And so over time, the creature becomes better and better suited for its particular local environment. And that's what he means when he says the process explains the match between the organism and their environment. So let's do a quick summary of this idea of natural selections. This theory, this mechanism for evolution. Individuals with certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. That's one part of this. Natural selection increases the adaptation of organisms to their environment over time. And if an environment changes, or if individuals move to a new environment, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions, and that may give rise to a new species. So when creatures from the continent of South America found their way to the Galapagos Islands were different from the mainland. And so over time, those creatures became adapted to the Galapagos Islands. They changed in such a way that they were no longer the same species found on the mainland. They could no longer interbreed, or they looked so different that we would consider them a new species. There is a multitude of evolutionary adaptations that we could discuss. Camouflage is, of course, a great one to look at. Over here on the left, we have a flower mantid in Malaysia. So think about like a praying mantis that you find here in Texas. Well, this is like a praying mantis type creature. You can almost not even see where it is. There's his head, his eyes. You can barely see the antenna. Look how closely he matches the flowers, the various types of orchids and flowers that he lives on. If you were a bug prey for this guy, you would never see him. He could sneak up on you and you would be gone. Or if you were a bird, you'd never see this guy. You wouldn't be able to pick him out and eat him. Look how well matched he is to his environment. Another good example, this is in Borneo. This is a creature that lives in the leaf litter on the forest floor, another type of mantid. Again, very similar to the praying mantis that we have here in North America. But look at him, the coloration and the shape. You would never be able to pick him out of the leaf litter on the floor. Now keep in mind that these adaptations are only good for their particular environment. If we were to take this leaf mantid and transport him to this place in Malaysia, and we were to take this flower mantid and transport him to the leaf litter on the floor of the Borneo rainforest, that adaptation, that camouflage, would suddenly be of no help whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it would probably be a major deterrent to being able to survive. So keep in mind that adaptations are only good in the local environment in which those adaptations arose. So a polar bear's white fur and thick paws, they help him in the Antarctic area in which he lives. The Arctic area in which he lives. But if you transported that polar bear to a rainforest, of course those adaptations are no longer helpful. One last note before we take a break about natural selection and evolution. We want to make sure to note that you understand that individuals do not evolve. A particular lion or a particular praying mantis or a particular oak tree does not evolve. Populations evolve. Remember, once that creature is born, its genetics are set. Evolution is a process that changes groups of creatures and populations over time. Individuals themselves do not evolve. Natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits that vary in a population. What that means is, if for a particular trait, if every creature, every individual in that population, if they're all genetically alike, if they're all genetically indistinguishable for a particular trait, well then natural selection has nothing to act on regarding that trait. If there's no variability, you can't have some that are a little bit better and some that are a little bit worse for that particular trait. Adaptations vary with different environments. What is favorable in one environment is detrimental in another. Just like we talked about with the mantids there. That adaptation is only helpful in the environment in which that adaptation arose. You want to think back to our discussions last semester about genetics. What is the basis for the variations that we see within individuals of a species? This variation is the raw material, the product that natural selection and evolution can act on. And if you think back, you'll remember that that raw material comes from genetic mutations. So think about all the copying process that we discussed in genetics last semester and the various mutations that can occur. That is what provides the raw material from natural selection to cause these adaptations over time. We're going to stop right there, take a break. This was a long section. We will come back with concept 22.3.